بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على خاتم الأنبياء وسيد المرسلين نبينا وحبيبنا محمد وعلى آله وصحابته أجمعين اللهم افتح علينا فتوح العارفين ووفقنا توفيق الصالحين وانفعنا اللهم بالقرآن والذكر الحكيم ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم أصبحنا وأصبح الملك لله رب العالمين اللهم إنا نسألك خير هذا اليوم فتحه ونصره ونوره وبركته وهداه ونعوذ بك من شره وشر ما فيه وشر ما قبله وشر ما بعده ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Alhamdulillah, it's an honor to be with you again for lesson 2 of this particular course, which is entitled The Roots of Interpretative Disagreements. This particular lesson I entitle The Revealed, the Rational, and the Real. And hopefully you'll come to understand why I titled it in that fashion. But just to reiterate, this particular course is a study of a text known as Tasheed al-Turuqat bi Nadmi al-Baraqat, the facilitation or paving of the roads through diversification of al-Waraqat, the legal papers of Imam al-Haramain al-Juwayni. This particular text, which we're studying, is a versified text or a didactic poem, which was composed by a 15th century scholar known as Yahya ibn Musa Nuruddin, also known as Sharafuddin al-Amriti, a scholar of the Shafi'i school from Egypt. And his particular work is built upon the work of a scholar who lived some centuries before him, as we know, Imam Abdullah ibn Yusuf, Imam al-Haramain al-Juwayni, the sheikh, one of the main scholars or teachers of Imam Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, radhiyallahu alayhim ajma'een. And so today we're going to be covering verses, beginning with verse number 13 of the text. But prior to that, I do want to offer some context once again, or reminder of some things that were brought up last week, not yesterday, but last week. That in the Quran, in Surah Hud, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He tells us in verses 118 and 119, وَلَوْ شَاءَ رَبُّكَ لَآمَنَ مَنْ فِي الْأَرْضِ كُلُّهُمْ جَمِيعًا. If your Lord has so willed, then all humanity would be believers. And then he goes on to say, وَلَا يَزَالُونَ مُخْتَلِفِينَ إِلَّا مَنْ رَحِمَ رَبُّكَ وَلِذَلِكَ خَلَقَهُمْ. And they will continue to be different, that we will not cease being different from one another, except for those to whom mercy is shown. وَلِذَلِكَ خَلَقَهُمْ. And for that, Allah has created them. And for that, Allah created them. Now, the scholars differ about what exactly is meant by the intent of this particular part of the verse. We're saying that's why Allah created us. Some say, yeah, that is to say that Allah created us to be different from one another or be at variance with one another. Others say, rather, no, Allah created us for His mercy. And so those are two perspectives on that particular verse. But what's important for us during this study is that to understand that the aim is for us to hopefully learn to better appreciate our differences with one another, in particular our ideological differences. We know that we struggle with other types of differences, our physical differences at times, but we also want to learn to appreciate our ideological differences, especially with regard when we realize that the foundation of our ideological differences may not be as decisive as we typically may understand them to be. And so I entitled this particular lesson, The Revealed, the Rational, and the Real, because for one, these three words, revealed, rational, and real, they themselves speak of different sources of certainty, or different sources of truth, that the deliberations or discussions in usul al-fiqh, or the foundations of Islamic jurisprudence, and even in theology, they take into consideration or appropriate certain aspects of philosophy. And there's no way to sort of divorce any type of real science from philosophy in some way, shape, or form. But the revealed knowledge that we believe as Muslims, that empirical knowledge is not the only source of truth. That empirical knowledge, that is to say that what we know through experimentation and through experience, that itself does not reveal the truth of everything. It can reveal the truth that certain things taste sweet, certain colors exist, and we experience heat or cold or other types of things like that, or what will happen if a person undergoes certain types of experience for a long period of time. But the metaphysical is not something which we believe it can be determined solely upon science. Rather, the physical, for us, it can be a foundation or a basis for determining or leading us to certain judgments, which we're going to talk about today, the issue of judgments as well. It can lead us to certain judgments about what is real, what may not be real. So some levels, it comes down to, on a certain level, it comes down to a matter of faith. So if we believe that this is a valid source of truth, then it will reveal or constitute a truth for us. But if another doesn't believe that to be a valid source of truth, then it may not be a source, it may reveal a truth to them. And so the revealed begin with that, but then the rational itself, that is to say that there are certain things we say that reason itself can be a source of truth. And realistically, reason is that area where human beings find common ground. It is that particular arena where human beings find common ground, because when you cannot agree upon, for instance, the Quran being the source of truth, or the Sunnah, or the Bible being the source of your truth, or other books or other types of religious beliefs or sources becoming the source of truth, then reason, we appeal to people's reason, right? We appeal to reason. And then the real, this itself is ultimately an expression of what we ultimately are seeking. We're seeking to sort of unveil or discover what is truly real, or we say what is truth. But in the process, we're also dealing with what we can speak of in very realistic terms. That is to say that I know that I'm sitting on the ground right now. And of course, depending on how philosophical you may be thinking, so are you really here? Are you really not here? We don't get into those type of sort of discussions because of how it can really take people into certain extremes, that we exist is real, but ultimate reality is God, as we know. And the truth that we seek is a truth that we believe it is fundamentally in accord with the divine knowledge, or that the truth that we seek, that we ultimately seek, is a type of truth that we believe it accords with the divine knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That we are seeking truth as it is with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as it is with God, or as it is recorded in that eternal book we call Al-Lawh al-Mahfuz, the protected slate, upon which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has recorded the destinies of all human beings and all creatures from beginning to the end of creation. So this is ultimately what scholars are seeking. So the scholars, when they are speaking about usul al-fiqh or the foundations of Islamic jurisprudence, that the aim is to try to uncover what they believe to be what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has ruled on a particular action. That this is ultimately what they are seeking. Now they know that they can't say for a certainty because revelation is over. That divine revelation is over. That the Prophet ﷺ, he came, the Quran was revealed, and no one can claim to be speaking directly, communicating directly with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And even at times when some claims are made that Allah has sort of spoken through an individual, that is all based upon speculation, that we really can't say for a certainty until we meet the Creator. But this is fundamentally what they hope to have arrived at when they make their particular judgments about different things. At any rate, hopefully that wasn't too philosophical for you, but I did want to begin with that. But so to emphasize the very fact that when we think about Shariah, that Shariah is a particular law or law code or moral code which has elements which are, some are static and others are dynamic. That when we speak of the Shariah, it encompasses not only law but also theology, the aspects of Shariah which are connected with theology, but more so our moral code when we teach it. And so in that sense, the revealed part, the unambiguous teachings of the religion are considered to be, of course, those things which are static. But the others, which are open to interpretation, where we have a discussion about them in the area of Islamic jurisprudence, or we call it Fiqh, those are the more dynamic aspects of the teaching. And this is why people disagree about the interpretation of this verse, the interpretation of this hadith. And as Imam Ibn Taymiyyah mentioned, as well as I alluded to last week, or I mentioned last week, was that the three basic fundamental reasons why the scholars disagreed. One was that they, for one, didn't believe that the Prophet ﷺ actually said something or did something. That was the first reason. The second was that either that it could be that the particular wording, the way that things are expressed in the particular hadith or the verse of the Quran were expressed in such a way they can be interpreted more than one way. And so some preferred one interpretation, others preferred a different interpretation. And the third reason was because they believed that an injunction had been abrogated, an early injunction was abrogated by a later injunction. So three basic reasons. But sometimes, so really our questions are related to, okay, well, why would they not believe that this is something that the Prophet ﷺ said? Or why would they differ about the interpretation of a word or an expression, right? Or why would they assume that one injunction was abrogated by the other injunction? And that's really, in a nutshell, what our studies are all about. And so if we begin with verse number 13, we see Imam al-Muriti, he begins by saying, Haka usul al-fiqh lafzan laqaba, and actually in the text that you have there, there's a word missing, laqaba, which be mentioned there as well, because the bait is incomplete without it as well. The meter is not completed, but what's missing is the word laqaba at the end. Haka usul al-fiqh lafzan laqaba, lifanni min juz'aini qad tarakaba. So that's actually what should be there. And so as translated here you have usul al-fiqh, the foundations or the roots of jurisprudence, an expression serving as a title for a discipline. Haka usul al-fiqh. So haka usul al-fiqh, or you have here, right, usul al-fiqh, lafzan laqaba, so the name itself in wording as a sort of a nickname or surname for the science itself. لِلْفَنِّ مِنْ جُزْءَيْنِ قَدْ تَرَكَّبَ. It is compounded from two parts. That is to say that the name of this particular science it consists of two different words, the word usul and the word al-fiqh. That's fundamentally all it means by it. And so when scholars begin to explain what the science is, they begin first and foremost speaking about what each part of the construct actually means. They look at the word asal, right? The word asal, and then look at the word fiqh. And so usul is what he deals with first. And so he says, al-awwal al-usuli thumma thani al-fiqh wal-juz'ani mufradani. Said the first is usul and the second al-fiqh, and the two parts are distinct. Right? So without giving, he's going to explain himself what each one of them means in his linguistic sense. And so it goes on and says, فَالْأَصْلُ مَا عَلَيْهِ غَيْرُهُ بُنِي مَرْفَعُ مَا عَلَى سِوَاهُ يَنْبَنِي. Al-asl, the root, serves as a foundation for other than itself. That is, say, the root of something is something upon which other than it is built upon. Right? So, like the root of a tree, right, or the trunk of a tree, an asl would be the root or the trunk of the tree. So the actual, the rest of the tree, the branches and everything else are built upon the asl itself. And so, in that sense, it is, in a literal application of it, that's fundamentally what asl is of something, the root or the foundation of something. So the root serves as the foundation for other than itself. And al-far', that is the branch, is that which is founded on other than itself. And so that's to say that the root is what's founded upon something other than itself. So it can't exist without a foundation, the root itself. The roots have to have the trunk in order to exist. And that is to say well, I think it's pretty clear what it says, but basically when the ulama, they may make the distinction between this particular science and the science for which this science is an objective. They speak about them in two different ways. So when they speak about usul al-fiqh or Islamic legal theory, foundation of Islamic jurisprudence, they call it al-usul, the roots, and it refers to al-fiqh, which is the result, the byproduct of this particular process. They call it al-furu', the branches. So the al-fiqh itself, or we're seeking the judgment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or the judgment we believe to be the judgment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That is the ultimate aim of studying this particular science. It is the usuli, or the scholar of Islamic jurisprudence or Islamic legal theory, is the individual who's trying to lay down the rules for which the jurist is operating according to, that he tries to lie down those rules. It begins with the assumption, all of them are beginning with the assumption that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, for one, when he revealed the Quran, he did not mean for the Quran to only be applicable during the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Rather, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted the Quran to be applicable beyond the period or the life of the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And if that is the case, then they also begin with the assumption that if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala means for it to be applicable, that it is also going to be applicable according to logical rules that conform with logic and with nature and with reason. So they begin with that as well. So it doesn't become a haphazard type of process where anyone could just jump up and say, hey, well, I think that this means that, right? Or I like this particular verse because it could mean that, without there being some particular criterion or standard for determining what particular interpretation is right or wrong. Now, for the Shi'a, this was different, especially after the doctrine developed, and that for them, they actually objected to the idea of an individual having, at least the early Shi'a, objected to the idea of people having the independent authority to actually interpret the Islamic law, to extrapolate judgment from the scripture, from the Quran or from the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. Rather, as long as the Imam was alive, then his interpretation was in accord with the divine will. Right? And so everyone had the obligation to follow what the Imams had to say about it, because in their view, he was an individual who inherited the prophetic light, right? And as the prophets themselves were infallible in their interpretation, these people who were inheriting the prophetic light were also infallible in their interpretation. So those who are on the earth had to comply with what was given to them, right? So this was different for them. But the Sunnis went in a different direction, right? They took a different direction. And so they said, well, no, Rather, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He left this matter open, but we also want to ensure that people don't go to extremes, that people have to be bound by certain strictures, that the strictures of language itself, that the language itself has rules. And if they have rules, that doesn't mean that we can just give meaning to words, any meaning that we want to give to them. It means that we can't interpret a word which was spoken centuries ago according to the way that we understand it today, right? So those are some of those considerations. So the furu' is the byproduct of the process of extrapolation we call istinbat or ijtihad. And so this is the ultimate aim of usul al-fiqh, is to lie down those rules so the jurists themselves, the fuqaha, can actually apply those rules and then reach what they believe to be closest to the divine will as possible. But still can't say at the end of the day whether or not it is. And this is why we find statements like the statements of Imam Muhammad ibn Idris al-Shafi'i, who is quoted to have said, رَأْيِي صَوَابٌ يَحْتَمِلُ خَطَأ, that my opinion is correct with the possibility of being incorrect. وَرَأْيُ غَارِي خَطَأٌ يَحْتَمِلُ الصَّوَابِ, and others, the opinions of those who oppose me are wrong, they're incorrect with the possibility of being correct. So there was a certain acknowledgement. They didn't see themselves as legislators, that they acknowledge that Allah is the only one who has the right to legislate, and our job is to try to peel away or to remove the veils that hinder us from being able to appropriate or to sift out the divine judgment, divine will, or knowledge of the divine will through the scripture itself. And so he says, وَفَالْأَصْلُ مَا عَلَيْهِ غَيْرُهُ بُنِي وَالْفَرْعُ مَا عَلَى سِوَاهُ يَنْبَنِي وَالْفِقْهُ عِلْمُ كُلِّ حُكْمٍ شَرْعِي جَاهَ اجْتِهَادًا دُونَ حُكْمٍ قَطْعِي. Right, so fiqh is the science of every Sharia ordinance that came through ijtihad. Fiqh is the science of every Sharia ordinance that came through ijtihad. So you have all these words translated in English for a person who doesn't know any of it. It's like, oh, what the heck does any of that mean? And of course, this is always the challenge of translation. There are always challenges of translation that often you don't find an equivalent word to translate from one language to another. And so sometimes you leave it as it is in the Arabic, you transliterate it, or you try to find a way to explain it. The standard definition of fiqh is the definition codified by Imam Shafi'i, which says that fiqh al-ilmu bil-ahkam al-amaliyya al-shar'iyya al-muktasabu min adillatiha al-tafsiliyya. It is the knowledge of the judgments related to action derived from scripture. Right? Knowledge of the legal judgments related to action derived from scripture, which is acquired min adillatiha tafsiliyya, which is acquired from its non-specific evidences or unspecified proofs. It is derived from its unspecified proofs. So this is a standard definition. And of course, that has to be explained as well. So basically, what this definition means is this. One, we believe that every action that we do has a particular judgment attached to it. That's a type of moral value that we assign to your action. As mentioned last week, even the movement of my hand, if I wink at you, whatever. Everything has a particular judgment. We believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, creator of the heavens and the earth, has given a particular moral value to these particular issues, these particular actions that we do. And he expects us to act, but he also expects us to know what the value of those actions are. And so a judgment is when we attribute something to something else, or we negate it from something else. So that's what we call it hukum. And hukum is isnadu shay ila shay or nafyuhu anhu. To attribute a characteristic to something or to negate the characteristic from something. But we also know as well about judgments, which is also something acknowledged in this particular science, is that judgments can be very misleading, or if the judgment itself is made based upon a faulty premise, then it can lead to misapprehension about the issue of the reality of the thing. So, imagery, if you had the wrong type of imagery, then you make bad judgments about people. So, for instance, if you're always seeing on television, for instance, blacks, committing crime, that you may be led to the judgment, the hukum, that blacks are criminals. That can be, or Arabs are terrorists, or that white people are racist, right? So those are some things, some judgments that you can be led to based upon what you, right, that you, if it's based upon a faulty premise, you see. And so the imagery itself can lead us to have a bad tasawwur, that we don't apprehend things in the right fashion. And so these particular judgments that we're talking about are not focused in the area of science, but rather we're talking about the area of scripture or Islamic law in particular. But I'm just giving you these examples to show you what is meant by judgment. And so the ahkam, so having knowledge of the judgments related to human action, right, which are derived from scripture, and acquired, and that knowledge is acquired from the non-specific evidences. And that is to say, so when we talk about the non-specific evidences, as opposed to the specific, so these are talking about their detailed evidences or their specific evidences as opposed to their non-specific evidences. The difference between the two is that if I ask you, what is your proof that Muslims have to make salah? You would say what? Quran. So is that an example of what? Specific or non-specific? It's specific, is it? See the entire Quran, so I can open up any verse in the Quran and each one of them says you have to make salah. So what is that? Specific or non-specific? It's non-specific, right. So this is the area that usul ventures into, realistically. So the usuli, the scholar of this particular science, is concerned with, okay, the Quran is a proof, is authoritative. And what makes it authoritative? That's what they debate. That there's things, or at least that's what they speak about. They try to explain what makes the Quran a source of truth, right? What is the basis of that? Now in fiqh, the fuqaha, the jurists, their concern is with the specific or the detailed proofs, right? So you ask the faqih, it's like, well, what is the proof that a Muslim has to perform salah, right? Then instead of saying the Quran or the Sunnah, they'll say, well, no, that in this particular surah, this particular verse, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says this, awaqimu salah, wa atu zakat. You understand that he will mention something specific, right? We call it dalil tafsiri. We call that. It's specific or detailed proof or evidence. So in fiqh, in jurisprudence, we want to know, okay, what is the action? We're seeking to understand the value of it, or trying to understand the value that Allah may have given to it, right? And so the action and the value. So if I know that in wudu, or in salah, I need to have wudu, that I understand a particular of jurisprudence, right? So what is the ruling of praying salat while wudu? Is that your salat is not valid. You have to have wudu in order for your salat to be valid. So that's just an example there. So here, of course, this particular verse doesn't go into all of that, but this is what is meant for us to come to. وَالْفِقْهُ عِلْمُ كُلِّ حُكْمٍ شَرْعِي. So fiqh is the science of every Sharia ordinance, or to say that fiqh is the knowledge of every judgment of the sacred law. So to knowledge of the judgment, every judgment of the sacred law, right? And so not every judgment related to theology or related to your basic ethics or virtual ethics, because in the area of ihsan, moral excellence or virtue ethics, that's also referred to as fiqh. Fiqh al-batin. It's called the fiqh of the interior. And this particular jurisprudence we're studying, we call fiqh al-zahir, the jurisprudence of the law of the exterior or the external state of the person. So what outwardly, fiqh of the outward, as opposed to fiqh of the inward. So to what we call tasawwuf, ihsan, ilm suluk, that's what we call fiqh al-batin, the fiqh of the interior, because we're concerned with the heart, the state of the heart of the individual, how to improve the state of that heart. So what fiqhu ilmu kulli hukm shar'i jaha ijtihadan duna hukm qat'i. So it is the knowledge, it is the science of every Sharia ordinance that came through ijtihad, or that is to say that it resulted from reflection, research, right? Seeking to develop or make certain logical connections between things. So it results from ijtihad, from exertion. Ijtihad from a word which means to exert oneself, as we know. Similar to, we get the word jihad as well, to exert oneself, to struggle. So it comes from due diligence in study, as opposed to coming from direct revelation, al-wahy, because we can't get that anymore. The Prophet ﷺ, with him, that was all over. That happened, it was over with him. But what was also interesting about this is that this particular ruling that results from ijtihad, he says that is a duna hukm qat'i, that it comes through ijtihad, but in part of it he doesn't translate, but it says it is not result from, I'm sorry, he doesn't translate on the next page, that said opposed to categorical ordinance. And so what he means by this is that some judgments are decisive, and others are indecisive. They're speculative. Some are decisive, some are speculative. Right. The hukum. So a hukm ala shay far'un an tasawwur. That the judgment you make about something, it is a branch, or it results from the way that you conceptualize it, or the way that you perceive of it. Yeah. So if you perceive of the thing wrong, you conceptualize it in the wrong way, then your judgment could be, incorrect. Yeah, but if it's the right way, then it will be in accord with truth and what reality truly is. So some hukum we call hukm dhanni, a speculative judgment called hukm dhanni. So in the static Sharia, that is the revealed law that was given to the Prophet ﷺ, in which we have no disagreement about this interpretation, those ahkam are qat'iyya. They are decisive, they're univocal, meaning that they're agreed upon, right? We don't differ about them. The mahkamat, we don't disagree about them. But in the fiqh, we don't delve into those because there's no need to. Rather, we delve in what we call the ahkam al-dhanniyya, the speculative judgments. And for this same reason, the scholars, they say, when they talk about al-fiqh, jurisprudence, they say al-fiqhu min bab al-dhunun, that jurisprudence is from the realm of speculation. Because the scholar, when he or she passes the judgment, gives a fatwa, is based upon her or his understanding of أظن أن هذا حكم الله. I think this is God's judgment in this matter. I think this is God's judgment in this matter. And that's one thing that cannot be forgotten, is that I think this is the way Allah has ruled in this issue. And it's a big problem for people that often it's like, because we come to accept, for instance, certain ideological trends, or we accept, for instance, the leadership or guidance of certain sheikhs or things like that. At times we overlook the fact that the sheikh is not a prophet. It's not receiving direct revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is a big mistake that people have made historically, this idea that my sheikh is the one, right? Or my group, they're the group. When the Prophet ﷺ said, al-ulama hum warathatul anbiya, that the ulama are the heirs of the prophets. He didn't say the ulama al-anbiya. He didn't say the scholars are the prophets. He said the scholars are the heirs of the prophets. And there's a big difference between the two. So being an heir, I mean, you inherit a legacy, a legacy of knowledge, right? And you pass that on to the people, and رُبَّ حَامِلِ فِقْهٍ إِلَى مَنْ هُوَ أَفْقَهُ مِنْهُ, that many people will carry knowledge to others who understand it better than them. Right, as the Prophet ﷺ said in the hadith, you inherit knowledge, and of course, hopefully the ethical framework as well, that you become an exemplar as the prophets were, alayhim salatu wasalam. But we have to make sure we don't make the mistake to think that because I like so and so much, I like how he sounds so much, that I believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is revealing all the time his truth to this person only, to exclusion of other people. And it's a big problem, but we have to understand the nature of fiqh, the nature of interpretation, that it is all speculative. It is in the realm of the probabilistic. Now, that is not to say that anybody can just interpret, right? Or that we should simply disregard scholastic interpretation. Rather, if you're not a scholar yourself, you have an obligation to follow an authoritative, a qualified interpretation. You do have to do that. Yeah. But just to understand that once you choose one, that you're doing it simply because Allah said, فَاسْأَلُوا أَهْلَ الذِّكْرِ إِن كُنتُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ, ask the people of the reminder if you don't know. And so I'm fulfilling the command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, even though I might be wrong. Right? But Allah won't punish me. Why? Because I fulfill His commandment of asking the people of knowledge, asking the people of the reminder when I did not know. Right, so some are speculative, others are decisive. And so in fiqh, in jurisprudence, we're dealing with those which are indecisive judgments about the law. So we have 4 schools in the Sunni tradition, right? But it didn't start off that way. That it started off with a lot of different schools, a number of different schools. Imam Tabari had a school, Imam Auza'i, Abu Thawr, Hasan al-Basri said had a school as well. And then some centuries went by, and then once it was appropriated by the state, and the state had a very major hand in crystallizing and solidifying the permanence of the 4 schools. This is well attested to when you read the history of Maqrizi, or even also Ibn Kathir alludes to this as well in his Bidayah wa Nihaya. He talks about like in the 7th century of Islam that that the Khalifa, the Abbasid Khalifa, who was known as Al-Zahir, that he opened up these courts in Egypt and then in Damascus, and he privileged the 4 schools. And then after that, it became something widespread. And that's not to say that prior to that it was just simply all about scholars working with the government. No, rather the scholars were developing their curriculum and their particular philosophy, legal philosophy, as a way to try to circumvent the authority of the governors themselves, to make sure that they didn't get too much power, rather. But it was also in concern with the idea that people live better if they have clarity, they have some clear direction about where they should be going. And so scholars gave consideration, they sympathized with that particular issue. And so it was something that developed over time. So he says, وَالْحُكْمُ وَاجِبٌ وَمَنْدُوبٌ وَمَا أُبِيحَ وَمَكْرُهُ مَعْمَ حُرِّمَ. The ordinances are either incumbent, recommended, permitted, disapproved, or forbidden. Right, so here now he's getting into the particular legal judgments. The legal judgments, or some refer to them as legal values. And so the first of them he mentions is what is called Waajib. And we all know this, but some of us don't know this. Waajib, what he translates here is incumbent. Like certain actions are incumbent upon the Muslim to carry out. Or the compulsory. Another way to express it is as compulsory. And so Imam al-Juwayni, in his waraqat, he defines al-wajib as ma yuthabu ala fi'lihi wa ya'aqabu ala tarkihi. Is that it is a thing, if you do it, you're rewarded, and if you abandon it, you're subject to punishment. You can be punished for it by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and then depending on the infraction, it could be even by the state itself, or by the governors. They can actually, or the society itself, represented in the governor, can actually punish you for certain things. So certain things are compulsory. It doesn't just simply mean you have to do it. For Muslims, it's like, well, you have to do it. But also, if I do this, I get rewarded for doing it. God will reward me for doing so. And every good deed is multiplied 10 times to even start with. Any good deed is at least 10, worth 10 of other deeds like it. We have to remember that. But some deeds are 700 times more, like give charity. You give charity, if I give $1, that's worth $700. Think about it. It's like, every time you give something in charity, it's at least 700 times worth it's what you're spending with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But there's some things that are compulsory. We know the 5 prayers are compulsory. We know the fast of Ramadan is compulsory. The Hajj, for those who have the capacity to make it, is compulsory. 5 pillars. But these are things that are not typically referred to as matters of fiqh. These are matters of Shariah or matters of the non-negotiables. So they're not necessarily even part of the Shariah. Rather, when we start talking about the Waajib in fiqh, we're talking about those things which are not agreed upon to start with, or rather the things we're trying to gain some understanding about. So for instance, is it compulsory, for instance, for an individual to do, we call it delk, so to rub your entire body during the ghusl, when you take a bath, right? You have to do that. That's a point of disagreement, But some scholars may rule that yes, it is. Others say no, it's not. So wajib was compulsory. If you do it, you get a reward. If you don't do it, you can be subject to punishment in some way, shape, or form. Mandub, a second, recommended. So incumbent and recommended. And recommended is the thing that if you get reward if you do it. And if you don't do it, there's no sin. It's not sinful to abandon it, but it's better for you to do so. Wa ubiha, and then he said mubah, permitted. And mubah, the third category, is that which is, we call, is simply either neutral or allowed. Another term used to describe it is jaiz, and some just say halal is another word for halal. Mubah, for many, is another word for halal, which is lawful. And the difference between this and the other two is that with mubah, it's neutral in that if I do it, there's no reward. If I do it, there's no punishment. If I don't do it, there's no reward. If I don't do it, there's no punishment, right? So I'm quite sure that some questions are going to come up about some examples of this, but I'll try to get through the text and leave enough time for questions. And so then he said, "Wa makruhu ma'ma hurrima." And then disproved, something which is disproved. A thing which is makruh, disproved, is something, if you do it, according to Imam al-Juwayni and the Shafi'is, this is their definition, and this text actually, it privileges the Shafi'i usul, and the Malikis as well in some areas. But the makruh is something, if you do so, la yu'aqab ala tarkihi, la yu'aqab ala fi'lihi. Something you do it, you're not punished for doing it. Wa yuthabu ala tarkihi. But if you abandon it, you get reward for doing it. However, for abandoning. If you abandon, you get reward for abandoning that particular thing. Ma'ma hurrima, and then lastly, or forbidden. So the last of the 5, so these 5 values or 5 judgments. The last is what is unlawful. And what is unlawful is not just simply something you're not supposed to do. Rather, it's something that if you abandon it, there's reward. And not doing it, right? As long as you avoid it intentionally, you avoid it. Because sometimes we avoid it because of conditions, environmental conditions keep us away from doing it. Some person may want to do something bad, like hurt someone, right? And, but because everybody's around and they're watching us, we don't do it. There's no reward in that, right? There has to be an intentional act in that you are resisting the urge to do so. And so if you avoid it, you get the reward, but if you carry it out, you're subject to punishment. مع الصحيح مطلقا والفاسد من عاقدا هذان أو من عابدي. And so here there's another mistake, an error here in the actual text. On the second part of the poem, it said من قائد. It should say من عاقد. All right, so not from a stander, but rather from a person who initiates a contract. Together with that which is absolutely sound and that which is absolutely I left my glasses. Sorry about that. Together with that which is absolutely sound and that which is absolutely corrupt, whether it relates to one concluding a contract or performing an act of worship. Okay, put it in more plain English. What this means is this: that beyond the 5 judgments we just discussed, Waajib, Mandub, Mubah, Makruh, and Haraam, there are another 2 more judgments which are important. And Imam al-Juwayni, in his waraqat, he said the ahkam are 7. The sab'a, al-ahkam sab'a. There's 7 judgments. And typically when you study usul that you learn, or you study fiqh, you learn that there are 5 basic judgments, not 7. So he said, so the way that you can reconcile between these 2 opinions about either 5 or 7 is that to understand that when something is said to be sahih or to be fasid, and sahih is another word for valid, and fasid is invalid, that the way that you separate between the 2 is that when the first 5 are the judgments that apply to the actions before we carry them out. And these 2 judgments, they apply to the actions after they're carried out. Right. So basically, do I have to perform my prayer? Yes. Am I finished my prayer? Is my prayer valid? I don't know. Depends. Right? Right. So then we would say sahih or fasid. And what also needs to be understood when we study this, we talk about jurisprudence and law as well, is that there's a difference between saying something is valid and something is accepted by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There's a big difference. A lot of people think, okay, well, because it was valid, it was accepted. And they also think that because it was invalid, according to law, that it was unaccepted. It wasn't accepted by Allah. When no one can dictate to Allah, when he will accept something or not. You had a question, sister? Yeah. You went to, I thought you had it. I thought you had your hand up. Okay. So a qabul is something different than a sihha or butlan or fasad. They're 2 different things, that we only know if Allah has accepted something when we meet him. All right, that's it. Beyond that, when we say that something is valid, it means that according to what we understand of the law giving to us, that there is no reason for us to think that a person has to make this over, has to repeat this act. Right? You form your prayer, all your chief elements are there involved, all your conditions are there. You finish it. We begin with takbir, you end with salam. Salat sahiha, meaning you don't have to repeat it, according to what we understand from the law. But with Allah, it may not be accepted because your intention may have been to impress people. It could have been many different things, right? You understand? So, and the same thing with an individual, perhaps a person who's just learning how to pray and they leave something out that according to the law, it would be considered to be invalid. I mean, we'll tell the person, yes, you have to make that prayer over. We'll tell them that. Person abandons prayer for 5 years. Say, well, do I have to make them? Yeah, make them over. Now, does Allah accept, what if I decide not to make them up? I can't tell them that Allah won't forgive them. I don't know. I can't know what the divine, will is in this issue. But based upon what I understand of the law, yes, you have to make them up. Make up those prayers that you miss. Make up those fasts that you miss. Because that's what the evidence leads us to. And so this doesn't really get into a lot of nuance about the Hanafi. The Hanafi says it has a bit more of a nuanced type of division of the ahkam, especially with regard to haram and makruh. And then even they make a distinction between what we call fasid and batil, right? With regard to these last 2 judgments of valid and invalid, that there's a third category. There's a valid, that's one that's invalid, batil, and then fasid is an invalidable, I guess you can say. Invalidable, is a word I made up. Fasid means that in this, it is an action which kana mubahan fi aslihi, that it was lawful, originally something lawful, but because of a condition, a description, a characteristic, it can be made invalid, but it can be also validated if that description is removed, right? So they make that distinction. And then haram, the Hanafis, they say that haram has to be, it is nothing can be called haram unless it results from decisive evidence. Like for instance, if it has to be from the Quran or from the hadith mutawatir, and it has to be univocal in its wording. It can't be open to interpretation. You call it haram then. And if it's something which is univocal but is not, mutawatir, that is to say, transmitted with indisputable authenticity, but the wording is clear and is unambiguous, then we call it makruh tahrimi. Okay. It's just like saying haram, but it just, but it's just of a lesser degree because the evidence that it was built upon wasn't as decisive as the evidence that haram was built upon. And the difference between the two is that if a person denies a haram, then they're put out of Islam. If they deny a makruh tahrimi, they're still Muslim. Right? They're still Muslim according to that understanding. And in makruh, you have tahrimi, you have tanzihi. So if it's an injunction which discourages an act, but the wording is not, if the word is ambiguous or something, they would call it like tanzihi. That's just a quick glance at that. There's more that can be said about it, but I'll try to get through the other verses, work through them very fast. Because I summarized the other verses so we can just read through the rest of them for the most part. So for Waajib mahkumu bithawabi fi fi'lihi wa tarki bil iqabi. So the incumbent is that for the performance of which reward is decreed and for omitting it punishment is decreed. وَالنَّدْبُ مَا فِي فِعْلِهِ الثَّوَابُ وَلَمْ يَكُنْ فِي تَرْكِهِ إِقَابُ. The recommended is that for the performance of which reward is decreed and for omitting which no punishment is decreed. وَلَيْسَ فِي الْمُبَاحِ مِنْ ثَوَابِ فِعْلًا مَنْ تَرْكٍ بَلْ وَلَا إِقَابِ. And there is no reward or punishment for performing or omitting the permitted ordinance from the sources of law. Right, so again, we talked about that. This pretty much, I summarized all of that. وَالضَّابِطُ مَكْرُوهُ عَكْسُ مَا نُدِبْ كَذَلِكَ الْحَرَامُ عَكْسُ مَا يَجِبْ. So it should be not aksun ma yujib, it should be aksu ma yajib. If you can see that vowel there. This should not be a tanween, it should be a one dhamma. So the criterion for the disproved, a makruh, is the opposite of the recommended, and likewise the forbidden is the opposite of what is incumbent. All right, so what it means by this is that, so if makruh is the opposite of mandub, it means that as in the mandub, the recommended actions, there's reward if I do it. In makruh, there's reward if I don't do it. And saying that haram is the opposite of wajib, or unlawful is opposite of compulsory, that's to say, because if I do something which is compulsory, I get reward, and if I do something which is unlawful, I'm subject to punishment. So they're opposites in that sense. وضابط التصحيح ما تعلق به نفوذ واعتداد مطلقا. The criterion for the sound, as-sahih should be valid. I was translated as valid. The criterion for that which is valid is that to it is joined implementation and unconditional acceptance. Or I think a better way to translate this would be that which makes something sahih, or the way that we understand something which is valid, is to say it is something which has legal force. Something which has legal force. An action which is sahih is something which has legal force. As sahih, it says, ma bihi nufudh wa ya'taddu bihi, as Imam Juwayni says himself in the Waraqat, is that which has legal force. So if for instance, if my marriage is valid, it's sahih, then it is permissible for me to be intimate with my spouse, right? It has legal force in that sense. So that's what's meant by it. And if it's fasid or batil, it does not have legal force, right? Meaning that interaction, that intimacy would be an unlawful or an illicit form of intimacy. وَفَاسِدُ الَّذِي بِهِ لَمْ تَعْتَدِدْ وَلَمْ يَكُنْ بِنَافِذٍ إِذَا أُقِدْ. The corrupt or the invalid action is that which is not accepted and is not implemented if contracted. Right. So pretty much just said that. This should be pretty clear, right? وَالْعِلْمُ لَفْظٌ لِلْعُمُومِ لَمْ يُخَصْ لِلْفِقْهِ مَفْهُومٌ بَلِ الْفِقْهُ أَخَص. And so al-ilm or knowledge is a word of general meaning, not restricted to fiqh in its meaning. Rather, fiqh is a more specific word. That is to say, what it means by that is that fiqh is a type of ilm, to begin. That a fiqh or jurisprudence or knowledge of law is a type of knowledge, is a category of knowledge. It's more specific than knowledge in general, and ilm. And so this is ultimately what we are seeking. We're seeking knowledge, al-ilm, through the study of fiqh or studying other things as well, but rather what we do get out of it is proximate knowledge. We don't get definitive knowledge because Allah doesn't communicate directly to us, right? But fiqh is a type of knowledge. It is more specific than knowledge in a more general sense. Then he says, وَعِلْمُهَا مَعْرِفَةُ مَعْلُومِ إِنْ طَابَقَتْ لِوَصْفِهِ الْمَحْتُومِ. And our knowledge is conjunction with the known when it corresponds to its firm characteristics. My eyes are blurry. I'm sorry. When it corresponds to its firm characteristics. So what this means is this: is that a knowledge, as Imam Juwayni says, ma'rifatu ma'lumi ala ma huwa bihi fil waqi'. It is to know something as it really is. That is what it truly means to know something. And know something as it truly is, again, and which also corresponds to the way that it is Allah's knowledge, right? Or we say, or as it is as recorded in the eternal book, Al-Lawh al-Mahfuz. And so that's what we are seeking through the study of things. And so then he speaks about the opposite too. Is that وَالْجَهْلُ قُلْ تَصَوُّرُ الشَّيْءِ عَلَى خِلَافِ وَصْفِهِ الَّذِي بِهِ عَلَى. And ignorance is the imagining of a thing contrary to the attribute that through which it arose. Or another way to say it is that if knowledge is to know things that they truly are, then the lack of knowledge or ignorance is to know things contrary to the way that they are, right? Or to apprehend things that contrary to the way that they truly are, right? Right. So if a person is colorblind or something like that, has a problem with, let's say for instance, I read firm is form. There's jahl, right? Because I can't see that well, right? الحكم على شيء فرع عن التصور. So my tasawwur is, I have a handicap in that sense, that my apprehension of the word that's written on my page is sort of handicapped because of not having my glasses. So firm becomes form to me. And so that's one definition of ignorance. And so basically he's saying that, that you need to know this because you have to be able to distinguish between when you truly have reached knowledge and when you have not achieved knowledge. So understand what truly the definition of knowledge, what it is. وَقِيلَ حَدُّ الْجَهْلِ فَقْتُ الْعِلْمِ بَسِيطٍ أَوْ مُرَكَّبًا كَالسُّمِّ. And it is said that the definition of ignorance is the lack of knowledge, which is called either simple or compound. Right. So the first definition of ignorance was that it is to understand things contrary to the way they are. This definition is saying that no, ignorance is just simply to know things as they truly are. Right? So the first one was like, it's red, but I say blue. I think it's blue. It's red, really red, but I think it's blue. But this definition is saying, well, no, I don't know if it's red or if it's blue. Right. I just don't know it. I just don't know what things are to even start with. So there's two different definitions. And then he says that there's two types of ignorance. Basit, simple, and then murakkab, compound. بسيطه في كل ما تحت الثرى تركيبه في كل ما تصور. Its simple form is in the Pleiades, and actually there's a mistake here. This shouldn't say Pleiades, because the Pleiades in Arabic is the Thuraya, which is the cluster of stars. The bright says the closest cluster of stars to us, the brightest stars, a constellation. And so the Pleiades is actually just to say the earth itself, So Athara is the earth itself, right? So, and you can see how that can be an easy mistake to make, Thara and Thuraya, just simply add an alif after it and becomes Thuraya, but, the translator had an oversight here. So its simple form is in regarding creation itself, existence itself, Athara, the existence itself, and its compound form is in everything that you give a mental form to. And so another way to look at this is like this, that simple ignorance is, when your ignorance is simple, is when you know it, when you don't know something and you don't know it. But your ignorance is compounded when you don't know something and you don't know it. That's fundamentally what the difference between the two are. وَالْعِلْمُ إِمَّا بِاضْطِرَارٍ يَحْصُلُ أَوْ بِاكْتِسَابٍ حَاصِلٌ فِي الْأَوَّلُ. And knowledge is attained either involuntarily or through a deliberate acquisition. And I'll read the rest of it and then translate and then comment afterwards for the sake of time. And it says, كَمُسْتَفَادِ, it could be mustafad, should be a tab before the fa. كَمُسْتَفَادِ بِالْحَوَاسِ الْخَمْسِ بِالشَّمِّ أو بالذوق أو باللمس والسمع والأبصار ثم التالي ما كان موقوفا على استدلال. And the first, meaning involuntary knowledge, is obtained through the five senses, smelling or tasting or touching and hearing and seeing. And the second, that is deliberate acquisition, is that which depends on deduction. وَحَدُّ الْإِسْتِدْلَالِ قُلْ مَا يُجْتَلَبْ لَنَا دَلِيلًا مُرْشِدًا لِمَا طُلِبْ. Give as a definition of deduction that which is brought to us as a proof and a guide to that which is sought. And so basically the idea is this, is that knowledge is what it is. It is to comprehend things as they truly are. Ignorance would be to comprehend things or to apprehend things contrary to the way they are, or to not apprehend them at all according to the way they are. But then knowledge itself has two basic types, or there are two factors involved in the origin of knowledge. One is we call it ilm al-ittirari or ilm al-dururi, which is immediate knowledge. That is the knowledge that we obtain without having to reflect upon it. Okay. So I can put my finger in the glass and touch the water, and I will say the water is wet, right? That I can see the glass in front of me. I can touch the table. That's immediate. It's not mediated by anything. Nothing intervenes in order for me to apprehend my reality. But then there's another type of knowledge which results from acquisition or through effort. And so this is the type of knowledge we are studying when we are dealing with jurisprudence, is that knowledge that results from reflection, results from study, things like that. So with that, I will open the floor up for any questions, but I know that this type of information can be somewhat intimidating at times, but I will promise you it gets a little bit easier. Inshallah. Yes, Fadda. Alaikum salam.
When you speak of jah and ilm as the kind of opposites, where would the understanding that, like, opinions? Opinions just kind of be like another form of jah.
Right. I'm sorry, did I skip a page? I didn't. Could we speak about dhann and shak? We didn't speak about that. Yeah, if I didn't skip a page, then that itself, huh? The next page, right? Okay, we're going to talk about that. Right, we're going to talk about that next. Yeah, but yeah, right. Mm-hmm. All right, we'll have a question here, well, a couple of them. Hopefully, I can read them. Please remind the class to write questions. Right. Okay, on the paper for AA, I guess. Thank you. This is me. So the reason why we're just asking you to write questions on the paper, because I have a tendency to forget what the question was, and I don't repeat it. Like, for instance, you just asked me a question, I didn't repeat it. Yeah, so people don't know, what your question was. All right. So so here's an online viewer asked the following question: when it is said in the hadith, "My people will not agree on an error," who are the people? Two, could you please clarify the statement about not following a sheikh? What did you mean by that statement? Right. So we're going to eventually get into the discussion of ijma', scholarly consensus, and the hadith of لا تجتمع أمتي على خطأ وعلى ضلالة, that my ummah would not unite upon an error, would unite upon misguidance. That particular hadith is typically quoted as proof of evidence for the authority of scholarly consensus in Islam. And so the people in this particular hadith, of course, scholars have differed about exactly what it means. And most of them are saying it means the scholars themselves, and in particular, and not even all the scholars. They're talking about those of the highest caliber, those of the highest qualification, those people who we call the mujtahideen. That's according to what most of the scholars themselves. But there's a lot of disagreement amongst them there. And then there's some who would just specify it and say it's only for the Sunnis. Some say it's only for the entire ummah itself. It includes the Sunnis and the non-Sunnis. You have those type of disagreements about the issue. So there's no agreement on who the people are mentioned in the particular hadith, and also because the hadith itself is not a strong hadith to even start with. So it's not the strongest proof for that particular issue of ijma'. And then also the early scholars of the earliest periods of the earliest commentaries on this hadith, they didn't understand it in the same way that Muslims later came to understand it after Imam Shafi'i. Because when they read the hadith, you could find these early commentaries, and actually what they understood from it was that there would never be a time when all the Muslims will be committing a particular sin. There are always going to be some of them who are not committing that sin, as opposed to the understanding that this hadith is proof that if scholars all say something, that all the Muslims have to accept what they say. And then the other part, the issue about statement about not following the sheikh. The idea was, I didn't say anything about not following the sheikh. The idea was what I said was that when we do choose to follow a sheikh, that we understand that the sheikh is not a prophet. That's the point I was making, is that there's a difference between being an heir of the prophet and being the prophet himself, or being a prophet. And so we don't interact with him in the same fashion. That we should not believe that the sheikh, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks exclusively through my sheikh. That may be a belief among some people, but others have no obligation to accept their understanding, because all rooted in speculation. And so that's really what my point was. Anybody else write down anything? Yes. Okay. Can you please report the definition of fiqh in Arabic? Repeat. Jahl. Can you please repeat the definition of fiqh in Arabic and English? Well, al-ilm, is this one of your questions from the audience, right? Okay, right. Of course it's from the audience, right? But then again, it could be from the internet, right? Is your question? Yeah, I can give it to you later, Al-ilmu bil-ahkam al-amaliyya al-shar'iyya al-muktasabu بأدلتها أو مكتسب من أدلتها التفصيلية. العلم بالأحكام العملية الشرعية المكتسب من أدلتها التفصيلية. And of course, there are many more than one way to translate that, but one basic translation would be knowledge of the judgments related to action derived from the sacred law acquired from their specified proofs. How is the real a source of truth if truth is what we are ultimately seeking? Right, so the real, no, that's a good question. So again, in the title, I mentioned the real, and I make it two distinctions. One distinction is I mentioned the real is mentioned as the ultimate goal for us to discover what is real, what is true. Or real in the sense of being synonymous with truth. But in another sense, when we talk about the real, we're talking about that which is perceptible, those things we can perceive through our senses and we know through experience. So remember that when he talked about al-ilm al-daruri or al-ittirari, knowledge which is immediate or unmediated, that particular knowledge is directly connected with the senses, what we apprehend through our five senses. Right. So again, I may touch fire for the first time and I get burned, but I may not realize that that every time I touch fire, it will burn me. But if I keep doing it and I realize, okay, yeah, every time I do that, it's going to happen. So as to make the distinction between a basic sensory judgment as opposed to an empirical judgment, which is related to will usually be a scientific judgment, we can say, based upon empirical studies. All right, where is this? I read that. If someone believing something makes it true for them, is this not acknowledging or accepting relativity? Okay, let's repeat that. If someone believing something makes it true for them, is this not acknowledging and accepting relativity? I think that it is accepting a certain level of relativity with the condition that the individual is able to understand that others have different understandings and have a right to different understandings. And as long as that becomes something we promote, then it becomes somewhat relative, but it wouldn't be relative in the sort of the Western sense of relativity, where we don't believe in moral relativity as Muslims, but there is a certain amount of a limited relativity, moral relativity that does exist. So, for instance, when we start saying that the opinions that are the result of the four schools are acceptable, and those that are not from the four schools are not acceptable, that's the type of limited type of moral relativity, right? So, Shi'i, we don't care what the Shi'ites have to say, because they're not one of us, right? So it's very limited type of relativity that does exist, and this is why historically a discussion that scholars had was regard to the matter of whether or not every mujtahid is correct in his or her opinion, and in particular would be his, because that's typically what you were talking about in most of history. And so it's every mujtahid musib. And so that was one opinion. The other opinion was the opinion that we call the mukhatti'ah. So this is what we call, this opinion is the opinion of the musawwiba, and then you have the mukhatti'ah, which we could say more of the absolutist type of views, which is that al-haq wahid, that the truth is one. There's only one truth, wala yata'ayyan, but we cannot specify who has it. So it was absolute, but then not totally absolute. It was like, yes, there's only one truth. And we have it. We believe we have it, but we can't really say for certain that others don't have it. The other opinion was saying that, well, all of them are fine. Kullu mujtahidin musib. If a person is qualified to interpret and it gives an interpretation, then it's a valid interpretation. You can follow it, and it doesn't really matter, right? That was the less accepted, but it was an opinion that did exist, in Islamic history. Can you talk about the 7 judgments again, specifically the last 2? Right, so the last 2 we talk about were the Fasid and the Sahih, valid and invalid. And so as mentioned, the first 5, compulsory, lawful, unlawful, disapproved of or disliked and recommended, that those are the judgments that apply to the action before you carry them out. And so if you do the action, then the consequences of doing those actions apply. But in terms of like reward or punishment or the lack of any of that. But with regard to the Sahih and Fasid, valid, invalid, these are judgments that pertain to the action or connect with the action after we do them. So an action may be recommended, it may be recommended for me to pray two rakats of sunnah, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I get the credit at the end. So depending on if I fulfill all of the things that need to be fulfilled in those 2 rakats of sunnah, those 2 units of sunnah, that will let me know if will determine whether or not the action needs to be repeated. Right. So there's a difference between valid and invalid, and accepted. Acceptance is with Allah. The law, when we say something is valid or invalid, is that to say that according to our understanding of what the law is, this is what makes it not something we are required to repeat. Can you review the definitions of the terms valid and invalid? I just did so. In the context of defining fiqh. Thank you, Sheikh. Alhamdulillah, thank you. So hopefully that was sufficient. How do you approach those with ignorance? Those that don't know and don't want to know? Well, we make dua for them. Yeah, make dua for them, and we show patience with them. And we ask Allah to make this not one of them. And that's the best I could say, I think. Time's up? Not even one more question? Nothing else on the internet?
I have one question.
Okay.
I heard so when we were talking about how
Mhm.
the pursuit is to understand
Mhm.
the judgment
Mhm.
as far as Makruh,
Mhm.
how do you explain to someone that, because I was sitting in a circle and someone said that Muslims created this out of laziness, which is crazy, but
Mhm.
I had a conversation. So how do you a simplified way to explain to someone that it wasn't through a process that these things were derived out of laziness?
All they have to do is refer them to all the books that have been written about it over the centuries, and it's pretty clear that it wasn't based upon laziness. There was no laziness involved at all. And we have thousands of millions of books, have been written about law, and continue to be written about Islamic law and jurisprudence and usul al-fiqh. And I would just refer them to that, and you'll see that there was a very deep thought that went into this, and there was a lot of transformation, a lot of at sometimes revision that occurred, and expansion of the discussions as well. So hopefully that'll help. All right. Jazakallah khair. I appreciate everyone coming out, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala increases our knowledge to give us openings from His wisdom. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to help us to understand His will and be people of emulation, people who emulate the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, people of honesty, sincerity, and people of illumination. Wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam tasliman kathira. Wa subhana rabbika rabbil izzati amma yasifun. Wa salamun ala al-mursaleen walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Ameen. Jazakallahu khair. Assalamu alaikum.